We have elders who are sleeping with guns or bats or something close to their beds.
Tonight, a drug-fueled violent crime wave is in northern Saskatchewan.
When completed, these homes will not just be a safe place of refuge,
while the feds vow to build more affordable homes.
I told them about this little story that I had called Guitar Lessons.
And a Nehiyaw movie maker may have another hit on his hands. Good evening, Tansei, and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. Indigenous leaders in Saskatchewan are calling on the provincial and federal governments to visit communities in the north to see for themselves just how bad the safety situation is. Leadership from Meadow Lake Tribal Council, Prince Albert Grand Council, and the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan recently told the media they are concerned about food security and gang-related crimes in the north. They want more resources, including funding, to address the problem and want government leaders to work out strategic plans with them. Vice Chief Richard DeRoche from Meadow Lake Tribal Council says elders and families are being affected.
We have elders who are sleeping with guns or bats or something close to their beds for safety reasons in some of our communities. We have parents that are safe and concerned about the safety of their children and about the raising of their children in our communities. Educators in the schools fear for their safety, fear for their children's safety in the schools. This is the reason we're here. We're not here to lay blame. We're here to raise awareness, to let the governments know that we're not all right in our communities.
The city of Yellowknife can expect 63 more rental units to house at-risk tenants next year. That's according to a new federal government announcement of more than $23 million. Projects will be managed by the Yellowknife's Women's Society and the YWCA. Federal, territorial, and municipal governments were on hand to welcome the federal minister and new money from the National Housing Co-Investment Fund and the Rapid Housing Incentive. Upgrades to the Spruce Bow will offer 42 bachelor apartments to both at-risk men and women, and Lynn's Place, a local shelter, will create 21 new spaces for women and children. Both projects are set to be completed in the new year and include support staff as well as wraparound services. Federal Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, Ahmed Hussein, says the goal is to rebuild lives.
when completed, these homes will not just be a safe place of refuge, they will allow these individuals to rebuild their lives and thrive. You know, having a safe and affordable place to call home can make the difference between just getting by to actually starting to get ahead.
And now an update on a story we've been following. At the end of October, Nunavut MLA Joseph Kukiak left the Legislative Assembly saying that he was facing criminal charges and didn't want to be a distraction. Now, court records reveal exactly what the charges are. Kukiak is facing 2 assault charges. One of those 2 is for choking. Both alleged attacks were against the same person, and none of the allegations have been proven in court. Under Legislative Assembly rules, if convicted by indictment, Kukiak would be expelled from the Assembly. If convicted as a less serious summary conviction, MLAs will decide his fate. Kukiak is expected in court in January in his hometown of Taloyuak. The contest to lead Baffin Island Inuit has begun, and the 2 Inuit vying for president have a long political history together. The Kikitani Inuit Association announced their two contenders for the December 12th presidential election. Olayuk Akasuk took over as QIA president last year when now Premier PJ Akiaruk quit the role to run for MLA. He is trying to keep the job. His opposition, former two-term Nunavut Premier Paul Okalik. Okalik was Nunavut's first premier and the only premier to serve 2 terms. Akasuk was a cabinet minister in Okalik's government holding the housing portfolio. The jury on the inquest into the deaths of Don Mamakwa and Roland McKay delivered its verdict in Thunder Bay late on Friday. Mamakwa died on August 3rd, 2014, and McKay died July 20th, 2017. Both men were in custody at the Thunder Bay Police Headquarters when they died. Asha James is a partner at the Falconers law firm and represented the families at the inquest. She joins us now from Toronto. Asha, thanks for being here. Can you tell us about the jury's findings into the deaths of Don Mamakwa and Roland McKay?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daryl. In a coroner's inquest, the jury is tasked with answering 5 questions, and in terms of this inquest, I think the one question that all of the parties couldn't agree to is by what means Don Mamakwa came to his death, and so the jury was undecided. Or undetermined, rather, in the sense that they didn't think that there was enough evidence that they could find that all of the actors, the paramedics and the police, all knew that their failure to do certain things would lead to Don's death. And they also, found that there wasn't enough to say that this was an accident, right? Some kind of event that happened that nobody had any foresight of. And so I think the family respects how hard the jury worked to kind of to get to that conclusion, and understands kind of the difficulties that they had with some of the evidence.
And speaking of the families, I mean, you were representing the families who attended the inquest every single day. How are they feeling about this, the verdict, and the recommendations?
The families, I think they're happy that the inquest is concluded, and there's been a public airing as to the facts that led to both men's deaths. And in terms of the recommendations, I think it was really important for the families to get a recognition of the lack of services in Thunder Bay for people suffering from alcohol use disorders. So, the recommendation for a sobering center and to increase detox beds was something that the family really wanted, and they were happy to see come out of this inquest.
Well, and speaking of those recommendations, the jury made 35 recommendations in order to avoid similar deaths in the future. Those recommendations are for the province, the city of Thunder Bay, police, and emergency services over there. So given what, some of what you just said, do any of those stick out for you?
I think definitely for all of the frontline service providers to ensure that they're providing culturally competent services and that they engage in training that's trauma-informed, that's based on reconciliation, that recognizes the harms that have been done to Indigenous people in this country. I think that's really important, because what we saw in this inquest is that there was a lot of bias and stereotypes that led to both Don and Roland not getting the help they needed and deserved.
And during this testimony, acting Thunder Bay Police Chief Dan Taddeo said at the time of the deaths of Mamakwa and McKay that the police service had a, quote, lack of human compassion. Do you think things have changed with the police service in the last 5 years?
We had evidence also at the inquest from former Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, and his evidence was that it's worse, that it's regressed. And so to me, the people best suited to be speaking about the progress or lack thereof of the Thunder Bay Police Service is the Indigenous community. And former Grand Chief Fiddler made it quite clear that it's nowhere near where it needs to be.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Asha, thank you so much for this and the updates, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, time for a short break, but first, here's a quick look at a story our Lee Wilson is working on about preventing the deaths of homeless people.
A recent preliminary report from the BC Corners looks at nearly 10 years of data up until 2021, and what it shows is alarming. Last year, 247 people on the streets died, a 75% increase from the year before. Vancouver, Surrey, and Victoria were the cities reporting the highest amounts of deaths. Nearly 3/4 of the deaths were considered accidental, with toxic drugs being the suspected cause. Coming soon, we'll be talking to the families of those impacted, experts, and policymakers to find out how to prevent these deaths from happening.
Welcome back to APTN National News. If you're Indigenous and sentenced to prison, you're likely to serve a longer sentence, have force used against you more often, and spend more time in solitary. That's according to correctional investigator Ivan Zinger. Here he is at a news conference last week.
Again, terrible outcomes with respect to Indigenous people who are incarcerated in federal corrections. And these included, for example, being overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institution, overrepresented in structured intervention units, which is the former administrative segregation regime. They are more likely to also be labeled as gang members. They're more likely to self-injure. They're more likely to attempt suicide. They're also overrepresented in the last fiscal year in terms of suicide. 5 of the 6 individuals that committed suicide last year were Indigenous.
Marty Maltby is the Acting Director General of Aboriginal Initiatives Directorate for the Correctional Services of Canada. He spoke to Dennis Ward earlier from our Ottawa studio.
Mr. Bolt, we appreciate you taking some time for us here. There have been 3 audits of corrections in 2022 alone. All say Indigenous inmates have worse outcomes than other offenders. They're released later in their sentence, overrepresented in use of force, overrepresented in maximum security institutions, overrepresented in structured intervention units. Can you tell us why that is?
The challenge of Indigenous offenders is very much a systemic challenge. Definitely within the overall justice system, Correctional Services Canada has a job to do. We continue to struggle. I mean, we continue to see our admission rates for Indigenous offenders continue to at least remain steady, if not go up a bit up on the rise in the last number of years. We've been seeing an increase in the overall population in 10 years in terms of for what we call the flow in terms of federal corrections. And you know, when we look at sort of the risk and need level of Indigenous offenders, it continues to be a challenging group of individuals. There have been significant improvements made since the reports. We've introduced what we call our Indigenous Intervention Centers, which is a streamlined case management approach to providing better intake and programs and release planning. We've received some additional monies through Budget 2017 to provide better support to communities, but it continues to be an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the correctional investigator says in the last decade there have been very little change in outcome for Indigenous offenders. All the issues that I just mentioned still exist. So, I mean, can you say there's been much change?
I mean, we are seeing an incremental change, in particular in our release rates. We've seen an increase in the last 5 years in our day parole and full parole rates. I think last I checked it was about a 23% increase over the last 5 years. We're also seeing better outcomes, I should say, in terms of returns to custody, especially after 5 years once released. But again, the challenge continues to be the admission rates and the overall numbers as well. We've revamped, I would say, as part of our National Indigenous Plan, our overall case management process, our programming interventions, and as I said, you know, we've provided some money, some additional monies to support communities' involvement with release planning as well.
Offenders that are released on statutory release have a harder time readjusting, according to the correctional investigator and the Auditor General. What is Corrections doing to ensure that Indigenous offenders are released earlier in their sentence like other inmates?
Again, we've seen a significant increase in that. As I said, that 23% increase over the last 5 years, and that's really about a day parole, full parole increase. So really the expectations is to ensure that they have access to the interventions and programming and supports that they need to address their risks while they're incarcerated, and then also to ensure that we have I'll call it that safety net in the community to actually be able to support them as well. For many of these individuals, I mean offenders in general, but in particular for Indigenous offenders, there's been a real breakdown in their connections and good connections to communities, that the reestablishment of those connections is challenging. So we've done a lot of work, and we're doing more every day to develop more partnerships, to enhance those community relationships, to provide better support in the community.
Like you say, lots of challenges here. Ivan Zinger did congratulate Corrections, saying that you're putting more resources to community corrections. Can you tell us what you're doing there?
Well, I mean, in general, we've seen a shift in our population in the last 10 years, which is good news, that we're actually seeing a significant increase in our numbers of offenders being supervised in the community. That includes for Indigenous offenders. One of the things that I can speak about from an Indigenous perspective, as I said, in Budget 2017, we received approximately $6.5 million that we invest on an annual basis to support that transition, for lack of a better word. Some of it has to do with, and we did increase some of our staff resources, so we have Indigenous community liaison officers and development officers who are there to sort of develop those partnerships and relationships with communities. But we also have funding that's directly directed at community support. So some of it could be working with communities to establish better relationships, to plan what we call our Section 84 release plans, which is basically a Indigenous community-centered release plan. The other piece is we just introduced in the last year or so a contribution program that will allow for some innovative projects working with Indigenous communities to better engage on things like trauma, counseling, addiction support, and gang affiliation.
Mr. Maltby, we'll have to leave it there, but certainly appreciate you spending some time with us here to talk about this.
Thank you very much.
All right, it's time for one final break, but still to come, chips, pop, and scrunchies. An Ottawa company comes up with a novel way to sell hair ties.
How it started and how it's going.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Featured here are Sherry Dion, Anishinaabe Knowledge Keeper, and Elder Amy Bailey from Circle of Turtle Lodge. They were attending the grand opening of the new lodge located in Pembroke, Ontario. Thanks to John Hamilton for the photo, and it's great to see cultural awareness training and cultural reclamation happening. You can send your photos to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be featured as our next photo of the day. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Beginning on the East Coast, 3 degrees in Charlottetown and 7 in Halifax. 2 degrees in Cartwright and 4 in Happy Valley Goose Bay. 6 degrees in Quebec City and 7 and clear in Montreal. 9 degrees in Toronto and 4 in North Bay. 1 degree in Timmins and 2 degrees in Sioux Lookout. -12 in Churchill and snow and -4 in Norway House. 2 degrees in Barons River and 4 degrees in Winnipeg. -6 in snow in Regina and -8 in snow in Saskatoon. Snow and -11 in La Ronge and -17 in Stony Rapids. Making our way west, -13 in Fort Chipewyan and -14 in Fort McMurray. -13 in Edmonton and -16 in Calgary. 8 degrees in Tofino and -5 in Bella Coola. -10 in Smithers and -19 in Fort Nelson. -16 in Dawson and -6 in Rock River. minus 13 in Norman Wells, and minus 14 in Clear and Fort Simpson, minus 6 in Inuvik, and minus 13 in Colville Lake, minus 22 in Cambridge Bay, and minus 20 in Chesterfield, minus 24 in Snow and Resolute, and a minus 6 in Snow and Iqaluit. The last total lunar eclipse for 3 years will start early tomorrow morning, painting the moon in a bright orange hue. The so-called Beaver Blood Moon eclipse is set to begin around 3 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday. The total eclipse will last about an hour and a half between 5:17 a.m. and 6:42 a.m. Eastern Time, as Earth passes directly between the moon and the sun. Lunar eclipses are totally safe to view with the naked eye. CTV's science and technology expert Dan Riskin says it's worth getting up early for.
When you have a total lunar eclipse, it doesn't disappear altogether. It's in shadow, but it's still lit up, and the light that's on it has a reddish hue to it. And that's because the light that goes through the atmosphere of the Earth and kind of bends around the Earth, the red can make that turn and get to the moon, but the blue light all gets filtered out. It all gets pointed down towards the Earth, and that's why the sky's blue, is because the blue light bends very easily. But that red light goes through and makes it that red color.
After Tuesday, there won't be another total eclipse until March of 2025. Aaron James wrote and directed the 2004 movie Hank Williams First Nation. He's got a new movie out now called Guitar Lessons. The movie was filmed in High Level, Alberta, and included several local people as cast and crew. The film stars Nehiyaw actor and comedian Conway Kootenay. The Cree language, Nehiyaw, is also a big part of the film about a 15-year-old youth. According to James, it's a story that many small town and First Nations people can relate to. Guitar Lessons drew some huge crowds when it played in Saskatoon at the Roxy Theatre. The movie is now touring several locations across Canada in the next few months.
So when the small town of High Level, Alberta contacted me and said, we'd like to make a film in our community to just bring some attention to our region, and we think it would be a fun and interesting thing to do. What have you got? And I told them about this little story that I had called Guitar Lessons.
And finally, a good news story out of Ottawa. A hair tie company founded by an 11-year-old Algonquin girl from Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe First Nation has started a unique way of selling their products.
How it started and how it's going.
Cookham Scrunchies launched their first vending machine this weekend at Bayshore Mall in Ottawa. Maya Beaudry started the company 4 years ago. She names each scrunchie after Indigenous role models in her life, and those are handmade with love. All right, that's such an awesome story, and hopefully plenty of people buy those scrunchies. And that's going to do it for this Monday edition of APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech.